So welcome to Jumbo IS and welcome to Geography and Environment lecture number 4 in this lecture series called Prelims Powerplay 2026. In this lecture series, we will revise the entire syllabus of UPSC Prelims for UPSC Prelims. This includes both your static portion and current affairs. You don't have to refer to any monthly current affairs magazines or PT 365s. Just follow this lecture series diligently. And to follow it, you just have to spend 1 hour every day. 1 hour, that's it. From now till your prelims examination, and everything would get covered. Now, just watching this lecture would be job half done, because just after watching this lecture, you have to memorize this lecture from the notes. Plus, your notes also contain certain extra information. So you have to memorize it from the notes, and definitely you'll be having some doubts. So we have enrolled you in WhatsApp groups where you can ask your doubts 24/7. And along with this lecture series, we are providing you with an exhaustive list of tests, a test series. Be regular with the test. Now, this lecture would come on YouTube at 9 p.m. every day. But for notes, for WhatsApp groups, and for tests, you would have to register on our app or on our website. Now, the registration details are given in the comment section below. But if you're finding any difficulty in registering for this batch, well, you just have to give us a WhatsApp on the number mentioned in that comment also. Clear? So make sure you register and you are regular with this lecture series, because if you're diligent, well, your chances of clearing prelims examination would be, well, very high. Okay, so be regular and be diligent. Okay, then let's start with today's lecture, and our today's topic of discussion is GEI Target Rules 2025. GEI stands for Greenhouse Gas Emissions Intensity. You see, India has made certain commitments with respect to reducing carbon emissions. In Paris Climate Summit, it said that we will reduce emissions intensity by 45% of our GDP. Plus, India has also promised that it will become a zero carbon economy or zero emissions, net zero emissions by 2070. Okay. Now, up till now, when India made these commitments, there was no legally binding rule on all the industries who emit a lot of greenhouse gases. Okay. It was all voluntary. There were no legally binding rules. But with this GEI target rules, well, now legally binding commitments would be given to industries, private corporations operating in certain sectors, and they have to follow it. This would definitely help India achieve its Paris commitments and net zero commitments by 2070. Okay, so this is very important, and these rules were released in October this year, 2025. So it is very important for us to understand them because questions can be asked. In fact, this is a very important topic. I suspect that definitely there will be one MCQ related to this topic. So please pay close attention. Okay, so let's begin. So Geography Environment lecture number 4. GEI Target Rules 2025, released by Ministry of Environment. Now, GEI, the full form of GEI is Greenhouse Gas, okay, which is also known as GHG, Emissions Intensity. Okay, so this is basically emission intensity rules. Okay, for that you need to understand what is emissions intensity. Okay, so let's talk about emissions intensity and then we'll move forward to what are the rules. Okay, emission intensity. Now, emission intensity basically says, or basically it defines how much of greenhouse gases are you emitting per unit output. Okay, per unit output. Now, what does that mean? If we are talking about emission intensity for India, the entire country, okay, generally it is measured as a percentage of GDP. So I'll tell you how. So let's suppose that India emits in 1 year a total of X amount of greenhouse gases. Okay, this is India's total emission of greenhouse gases. When you divide it by GDP, you get emissions intensity of GDP for India. Okay, so this is measured as with respect to GDP. So 1 rupee increase in GDP. By 1 rupee increase in GDP, how much greenhouse gases are you emitting? This is emission intensity for the entire country. Remember this. And in Paris Climate Agreement, India has said that we will reduce this emissions intensity by 45% by 2030. Okay. Now, the rules given by this GEI target rules, these GEI target rules are for individual industries. Okay. For example, aluminium industry, iron and steel industry. So it is not for pan-India, these are for individual industries. How are these emission intensities for individual industries measured? Remember this. So when we talk about emissions intensity for individual industry, we measure it in terms of per ton of output. Okay, so I'll explain how. Let's suppose we are talking about iron and steel industry. So let's suppose there is an iron and steel factory and it emits X amount of greenhouse gases. Okay, X tons of greenhouse gases in 1 year. And to emit those greenhouse gases, it produces, let's suppose, 100 tons of steel. So to produce 100 tons of steel in 1 year, it emits X amount of greenhouse gases. So emissions intensity for this iron and steel factory would be 100 tons or X greenhouse gases divided by 100 tons. So basically, amount of greenhouse gases emitted per ton of steel produced would be emission intensity for this iron and steel factory. Now what has the government done? Government has put a limit, cap on every industry. Okay, they have put a limit to their emissions intensity. So government must have said, for example, I'm just quoting an example, that your emission intensity should not be more than 100. Okay, so per ton of steel produced, you cannot emit more than 100 greenhouse gas units. Okay, these targets, these limits are put, legally binding limits are put under GEI target rules. Earlier, it was all voluntary. If a factory wants to reduce greenhouse gases, it can. If it doesn't, it won't. But under these target rules, we have put a cap, a limit on the emissions intensity of certain industries. Not all, certain industries. This is what we mean by GEI target rules. Clear? So let's talk about these GEI target rules in a little bit more detail. Okay? All right then. So GEI target rules. So GEI target rules basically operationalize sector-specific emission reduction targets for industrial units. Okay? For every industrial unit. Now, currently, as of now, under these GEI target rules, we are only covering 4 highly polluting sectors. Which are those 4 sectors? Well, these 4 sectors are aluminium, cement, pulp and paper, and chlor-alkali. Okay, so under these GEI target rules, these are the country's first legally binding targets for 4 major high emission sectors. Slowly and gradually, we'll add more sectors under these rules. But to begin with, there are only 4 sectors. Okay, these are those 4 sectors. These rules were notified by Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change on October 8, 2025. The purpose of these rules is to limit greenhouse gas emissions per unit of product output, which is called emissions intensity. Okay. Now, the advantage of these rules is that it would allow India to fulfill its Paris commitment. And what was India's Paris commitment? There are many commitments that India made with respect to climate change. One of those commitments was reducing emissions intensity of India's GDP by 45% by 2030 from 2005 levels. So whatever emissions intensity was there in 2005, India would reduce it by 45% by 2030. You understand? Now these legally binding rules would allow India to achieve this target by 2030. At least if it won't allow, then it would be a step in that direction. So this is a good thing. Plus it's also a step in the direction of achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2070. Yes, sure. So it's a good thing. Clear? Now, let's talk about the key features. Okay, let's talk about these rules in a little bit more detail because questions can be asked. So key features. So first of all, which sectors would be covered? We have discussed 4 sectors. So it would cover 282 industrial units across 4 sectors. Which are those 4 sectors? Highly polluting sectors: aluminium, cement, pulp and paper, and chlor-alkali. Okay, as of now. What is the compliance period? These rules are for 2 years. Okay, targets are set for 2 fiscal years: 25-26, 26-27. In 25-26, on average, they would reduce 2 to 3% of their emissions intensity from baseline level, previous levels. And in the next year, they would reduce up to 7.5%. So every year, the targets are going to become more aggressive. Okay, first year 2 to 3%, next year 7.5%. Okay, and how is emissions intensity measured? Remember, this emissions intensity target, this limit, this cap is measured in terms of tons of CO2 equivalent per unit of product. Okay, so tons of CO2 equivalent released per unit, per ton of aluminium, per ton of iron and steel, per ton of paper produced. Simple. Now, what do you mean by tons of CO2 equivalent? Okay, the thing is, first let's talk about this word equivalent. You know that there are multiple greenhouse gases. Carbon dioxide is just one greenhouse gas. there is methane, there are various nitrous oxides, there are many greenhouse gases, and these are emitted by these industries. Okay. Now, we basically measure CO2 and we measure other gases as equivalent to CO2. Okay. So, let's suppose CO2 causes, and I'm just giving you an example. Let's suppose CO2 causes 4 global warming. Okay. 4 degrees Celsius of global warming. Okay, let's suppose 1 ton of CO2 causes 4 global warming and 1 ton of methane causes, well, 16 global warming. Methane. So we'll say that methane is equal to 4 times carbon. Yes. So if 1 ton of methane is released, we'll say 4 CO2 equivalent is released because methane has 4 times more global warming potential. You understand this point? Because carbon dioxide causes 4 global warming, methane causes 16. So if 1 methane is released, it means 4 carbon dioxides are being released. So we'll write methane as 4 carbon dioxide equivalent, right? So we'll measure all of this, all greenhouse gases based on their global warming potential in terms of carbon dioxide equivalent and tons. 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent divided by per ton of output. This is how we measure, well, emissions intensity for each industrial unit. Okay, so you understand the units and the limits would be put. So the limit would be, let's suppose 100 ton CO2 equivalent of emissions intensity target for, let's suppose, steel industry. That's how targets would be given. You understand? Okay. Now, let's suppose what happens is, let's suppose there is an iron and steel industry, and for that industry, the target is 100. Let's suppose that iron and steel factory basically emits only 98. So its target was 100, but it was able to emit only 98. It was able to reduce 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of output. Yes. So for these 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, this factory would get, well, 2 carbon credits. Okay. This factory would get 2 carbon credits. And these 2 carbon credits can be sold in the market. So they will get a financial reward for reducing their emissions intensity by 2. These can be sold in the market. Now, who would buy it? It would be mandatory for a factory to buy these 2 carbon credits who is emitting 102. So there is a steel industry for whom the target was 100, but it could not achieve that target and it emitted 102. So the permission to emit these extra 2 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent would come only if it spends money to buy these 2 carbon credits. So the one who reduces emissions intensity will be financially rewarded, and the one who doesn't and exceeds the target would have to spend money. It will be a financial loss. You understand? This is how this scheme will go. So GEI target rules, mechanism of implementation, market-based incentive. Industries achieving the targets will earn carbon credits, which will be issued by Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Just remember that the verification would be done by Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and they would issue these carbon credits. They have to first check whether you have reduced emissions intensity or not. Okay. Non-compliant industry must buy credits or face environmental compensation equal to or twice the average price of carbon credits in that respective year. So they will be penalized. The scheme encourages investment in cleaner technologies. If you want to earn through carbon credits, you would invest in cleaner technologies, transforming emissions reduction into an economic opportunity. You see, people don't take action just out of their love for the environment. People take action when there is money involved, and government realizes that. That is why government has linked environment with money, because now government knows that this greed for money will force industries to reduce emissions intensity. If you don't, you'll be penalized. If you do, you'll earn money. So this is a good market-based mechanism where you link economic incentives with environmental protection. Yes, so this is a very good thing. Clear? Now, what is the significance of these rules? So this would be a paradigm shift from voluntary. Earlier it was all voluntary. Now it is legally binding climate commitments for high emission industries. Okay. This will foster low carbon industrial growth and operationalize India's commitments under Paris, under net zero emissions. Okay. Plus, we just talked about carbon credits. Okay. the rules for carbon credits, how carbon credits would be given, how carbon credits would be traded, how carbon credits would be sold, all these rules were already published under Carbon Credit Trading Scheme in 2023. So government had already released rules for carbon credits. But this carbon credits rules, these rules were not operationalized. Why? Because there were no targets on the industries, right? There was this regime, carbon credits. It was done in 2023. But this regime was not operationalized for 2 years. Why? Because there were no limits on industries. So how would you know they should get carbon credits or not? There were no limits, right? So it is said that with these GEI target rules, now you can implement CCTS. CCTS was redundant until and unless GEI target rules did not come. So with the operationalization of GEI target rules, now we can operate CCTS scheme. Okay, and this is a very good mechanism because until now you were only appealing to industries on humanitarian grounds that please reduce emissions, please reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But now you have linked money with it. Now they will. Okay, pleading, prayers, requests, they don't work. Money works. Okay, so it has promoted market-driven approach to decarbonization. So this is a very good thing. Clear? So these are GEI target rules. That's all you need to know about them. But we have introduced a new scheme called CCTS. So you need to know some information about CCTS also because now this is also enforced through GEI target rules. So now let's talk about Carbon Credit Trading Scheme 2023, which was released in 2023. Okay. So about CCTS 2023. Again, a market-based mechanism to regulate and facilitate trading of carbon credits within Indian carbon markets. You cannot trade these carbon credits abroad. It is within India only. Okay. Now, this was introduced in India under Energy Conservation Act 2022. The purpose to decarbonize the Indian economy by pricing greenhouse gas emissions. If you exceed the target, well, there will be a price you have to pay. Okay. Purpose again to incentivize industries to adopt cleaner technologies and reduce emissions intensity cost effectively. Clear? Simple. Now, certain key features about this carbon credit trading scheme. So, there is a mandate. Under CCTS, you have basically identified 8 industries. Okay, these 8 sectors would be under carbon trading scheme. Okay, but out of these 8, GEI has identified only 4. Later in GEI target rules, next 4 would also be added. But CCTS was launched for 8 sectors. Okay, aluminium, cement, pulp, paper, chlor-alkali, iron, steel, textile, petrochemicals, and refineries. So refineries, petrochemicals, textiles, they'll be added later. Okay, who would provide carbon credit certificates? Okay, so entities exceeding their emission reduction targets earn tradable carbon credit certificates. Okay, each representing 1 ton of CO2 equivalent reduced, and this would be given by Bureau of Energy Efficiency. Okay, failure. If you fail and if you exceed your limit, entities failing to meet targets must buy credits or face penalties. Okay. Oh, this is from previous lecture. I'm so sorry. But yeah, these are the key features. Now, what is the mechanism? Well, there is a compliance mechanism. Mandate sector-specific GHG intensity targets with penalties for non-compliance. Then there is an offset mechanism. So if you are exceeding your target, you can offset it by buying carbon credits. Okay. BEE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, issues carbon credit certificates and manages the National Registry and Trading Platform. And carbon credit trading occurs on regulated exchanges, okay, on regulated market platforms, so that there is transparency and stability. Yes, okay. Now, scope of this CCTS. So before CCTS, there was another carbon credit regime, okay. It was called PAT, perform, that means reduce greenhouse gases, achieve and receive a certificate and then trade the certificate. PAT scheme, perform, achieve, trade, okay. CCTS basically replaces PAT because PAT was not working properly. Okay, so CCTS replaces PAT. So CCTS supersedes PAT scheme and represents a more comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions platform. Coverage. Initial implementation involves about 800 entities across 9 industrial sectors, 8 or 9. But again, these sectors would be operationalized, or these sectors, I mean, these targets would be mandatory for these sectors only under GEI rules, because GEI rules puts limits on them. Types of emissions that are covered, okay, for which you will get carbon credit. So if you reduce the following types of emissions, then only you will receive a carbon credit. So covers direct emissions, indirect emissions like electricity and heat consumption. So number one is when you're emitting carbon dioxide yourself. Number two is you're not emitting carbon dioxide yourself, but you're consuming electricity. That electricity is coming from coal-based power plants. Those power plants are emitting electricity. So you are indirectly contributing to greenhouse gas emissions, right? So this is also covered. And scope 3, emissions related to import-export of products. So if you're importing a product which emits a lot of carbon dioxide, those carbon dioxide would also be added to your account. Okay. So these types of emissions, direct, indirect, and import-export, they are covered. 3 scopes of emissions are covered under this. Clear? So this is CCTS. Simple. Now, related to this, there is another carbon credit-like trading scheme. Okay. You all know that afforestation, planting more forests, is very important. Why? Because these forests, these trees, absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay. So if you want to absorb excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, you need to plant more forests. Yes. Plus, planting more forests would conserve nature, biodiversity, everything. There are so many advantages of planting more forest, afforestation. Now, up till now, well, the government was just telling people, please plant more forests. It was all voluntary. But government thought that let's connect afforestation with money again. Like we did in CCTS or GEI target rules, let's connect afforestation efforts with money. So if you'll plant more forest, you can earn money or you will get some financial benefits. And just for afforestation, not greenhouse gas emissions, for afforestation only, we have launched Green Credit Program. So the amount of trees you are going to plant, you will get green credits. Okay. Now, what is this Green Credit Program? Let's talk about this because it is somehow associated with this. Okay. Green Credit Program, an innovative market-based mechanism launched under Environment Protection Act 1986. Okay. Primary aim of incentivizing voluntary environmental positive actions such as tree plantation, eco-restoration, water conservation, sustainable land management. So there are no targets set. If you plant more forests, you will get green credits. There are no targets that you have to plant these many forests. No targets. So it's voluntary. It's up to you. It's your choice. But the government has given you a financial benefit. If you are not planting any forests, okay. But if you are planting forests, then we'll give you these green credits. Okay. It was launched in October 23 as part of India's Lifestyle for Environment Initiative, LIFE initiative. Now, under CCTS, remember this. Well, the people who can earn carbon credits are corporations, companies. Okay. But under Green Credit Program, the people who can get these green credits are individuals, communities, these things. Okay. So fosters community and corporate participation in environmental restoration. They'll get more benefit. Okay. Yeah. Now, key features. How can you claim a green credit? After 5 years of restoration. So you won't be getting this green credit if you have planted a forest and you're saying, give me a green credit after 1 year. No, we will look at that forest for 5 years. So after 5 years of restoration on degraded forest land and achieving a minimum 40% canopy density. Canopy density means that there is a land on which you have planted trees. The shadow of those trees should cover 40% of the land. That is canopy density. 1 green credit is equal to 1 tree which is 5 years old. So for every tree you will get 1 green credit. These credits are not tradable. I'll tell you what is the advantage of these credits. Okay, they are not tradable, they are non-transferable. But you can give these green credits. If there is a company, it can give it to their own subsidiary. Okay, or you have to just keep these green credits and exchange only once. So credits are non-tradable, non-transferable except once between a company and its subsidiary. And after one exchange, well, it will be reduced. It will extinguish. Now, where can you use these green credits? Okay, let's suppose there is a company which destroys a forest to build a mall. Now, when they destroy a forest, they have to contribute some money to plant a new forest. And the money goes to Campa Fund. Okay, but you don't have to contribute this money if you already have green credits. So compensatory afforestation requirements, then certain corporates have corporate social responsibility, then certain companies have environmental, social and governance requirements. These green credits can be used over here. That's about it. Okay. And one more thing, certain key facts. Who will give you these green credits? So Indian Council of Forest Research and Education ICFRE is the administrator responsible for verification, monitoring, and issuing green credits after verification. Okay. Primarily benefits individuals, communities instead of corporations under CCTS. Okay. And that's about it. That's all you need to know as far as market-based interventions to prevent climate change. Okay, that's all. And with that, we conclude today's lecture. I hope you understood everything. But if you have any doubts, well, you are in these WhatsApp groups. Do ask your doubts. Okay, and be regular and consistent with this lecture series, because this lecture series won't help you at all if you do not follow these 4 golden steps. Watch the lecture regularly, memorize the notes, ask your doubts, and be regular with the tests in the test series. Follow these 4 golden steps, and I shall see you next time with another topic in this lecture series called Prelims Power Play. Thank you, everyone.